Right now, at this very second, millions of tons of water are actively trying to tear a hole straight through the state of Louisiana.
Yeah, it really is a massive, relentless amount of water.
It is. I mean, the laws of physics are basically demanding that this massive flow of water, the water draining the entire North American continent, completely shift its course.
It desperately wants to move, yes.
Right. And the only thing stopping that from happening, the only thing preventing a geographic event that would literally bankrupt the American economy and leave major cities without drinking water, is just one single, heavily stressed fortress of concrete and steel holding all that water hostage.
I know, it sounds like complete science fiction, right? But it is the absolute precarious reality of our modern infrastructure.
It's terrifying when you really think about
It
it.
is. We have spent, well, pretty much the last century engaging in a multi-billion-dollar war against the basic physical properties of water.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because we are looking at a river that honestly defies human comprehension, the Mississippi River. It is 2,340 miles long.
Which is just staggering.
Right. And its drainage basin covers 40% of the continental United States. So for you listening, we are talking about a funnel that collects rain from the Rocky Mountains in the west all the way to the Appalachian Mountains in the east and just drags it all down into the Gulf of Mexico.
And it drags a lot of mud and history along with it.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to understand how this isn't just a geographical feature. The Mississippi is a complex, heavily contested machine.
A machine is the perfect word for it, actually.
Yeah, it's a mirror reflecting our obsession with engineering, our economy, and ultimately this grand illusion that we can achieve total control over nature.
And to really understand that illusion, you have to completely shift your perspective on what a river actually is.
Oh, so?
Well, we look at the water flowing past, say, St. Louis or New Orleans, and we think, oh, look at this majestic piece of nature. But the Mississippi of today is one of the most intensely engineered, artificially constrained systems on planet Earth.
I think we really underestimate how artificial it is now.
We do. Think about the human body for a second. Your circulatory system is a marvel because it's fluid, right? Veins and arteries twist, adapt, expand, and contract to get blood where it needs to go.
Right, it responds dynamically to the environment.
Exactly. Now imagine if a surgeon went in and decided that your circulatory system needed to be perfectly straight.
Oh, wow. That sounds terrible.
Right. Imagine encasing your veins in a concrete straitjacket just to make the blood move faster, more efficiently.
Yeah.
You would be fighting the very nature of the organism.
It would completely break the system.
And that is precisely what we have done to the Mississippi. It is less of a wild river and more of a managed piece of infrastructure, trying very, very hard to break out of its straitjacket.
But to really grasp how tight that straitjacket is, and why we felt the need to put it on in the first place, we have to look at what the river was in its raw state. We have to go back into deep time.
We really do. If you rewind the clock, about 10,000 years to the end of the last ice age, the Mississippi was completely unrecognizable.
Like, it didn't look like a single river at all.
Not even close. It was shaped by the melting of the massive Laurentide ice sheet, which covered much of North America back then. You had these unbelievable volumes of glacial meltwater just violently carving out the upper valleys.
I can't even imagine the scale of that water flow.
It was chaotic. In this era, the river was what hydrologists call a braided system.
A braided system. I hear that term a lot in hydrology discussions. What does a braided river actually look like, and why does it do that?
Think of a frayed rope. A braided river doesn't have one neat, deep, single channel. It's this chaotic, shallow network of dozens of interconnected streams that constantly cross over each other.
Oh, so it's just spilling everywhere.
Yeah, and this happens because the glacial meltwater was carrying an immense load of heavy sediment. We were talking gravel, massive rocks, coarse sand.
Heavy stuff that the water can't push easily.
Exactly. The water couldn't move all that heavy material fast enough, so it would constantly drop it. That creates a little island of gravel, which then forces the water to split and flow around it. It was a raw, incredibly wide, cold, and violent post-glacial force.
So it's essentially choking on its own debris and having to constantly carve new paths around it.
That is a great way to put it, yeah. But as the climate warmed and the glaciers finally retreated, that heavy, rocky sediment load declined, and the river transitioned.
It calmed down a bit.
It did. It started carrying finer silts and clays, and it settled into the meandering, curving path we recognize today.
I want to pause on that meandering path for a second because this is really where human civilization enters the picture for us. That sweeping natural state became the absolute foundation for early life on this continent.
The soils it created were just incredibly rich.
Yeah, and the era that really stands out here is the Mississippian period.
Yeah.
Specifically, between AD 1000 and 1350, there was this massive cultural and economic center called Cahokia.
Right across the river from present-day St. Louis.
Exactly. And we are talking about 4,000 acres, featuring over 120 massive earthen mounds. One of them, Monk's Mound, has a footprint larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Which is just staggering when you consider this was centuries before European contact.
And they had no pack animals, no wheels.
None. They built those mounds by moving millions of cubic yards of earth completely by hand in woven baskets. And yeah, Cahokia existed at that specific spot entirely because of the river.
It was the ultimate infrastructure before we had steel or concrete.
Precisely. The river provided a massive, fertile floodplain for growing corn. But more importantly, it was the interstate highway system of the ancient world.
It connected everyone.
It really did. The archaeological record shows trade goods at Cahokia that came from the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. The river gathered people together. It was a political magnet and a deep spiritual axis.
But calling it one river, even back then, feels a bit misleading to me, because when you map the hydrology of this river, you realize it's almost schizophrenic.
Oh, absolutely.
It behaves like four completely different worlds stitched together.
It really does. You can trace its personality changes as it moves south. It starts up north with the upper Mississippi, running from Lake Itasca in Minnesota down to Wisconsin.
Right, and up there it's completely different.
Yeah, up there the river is narrow, it's heavily forested, the water is cold and relatively clear. It has this very quiet, almost intimate beginning.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of people literally walking across the Mississippi at its headwaters. You just step over the stones.
Exactly. But then it completely changes character as it becomes the middle Mississippi flowing down through Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois.
The landscape really opens up there.
It does. You get these dramatic, towering limestone bluffs along the edges. The channel widens out significantly, and the surrounding land becomes heavily agricultural.
And then below the confluence with the Ohio River at Cairo, Illinois, it hits the lower Mississippi.
Oh yeah, this is the behemoth.
It really is. From Kentucky all the way down through Louisiana, it is incredibly deep, massive, powerful, and just highly industrialized. This is where it functions as a high-volume global shipping artery.
Which finally drops us into the fourth segment, the Delta in Louisiana.
Where it just falls apart.
Yeah, the river hits the flat coastal plain and just shatters. It splits out into this vast, fragile network of wetlands, bayous, and distributaries before bleeding out into the Gulf of Mexico.
But wait, looking at how dynamic all these segments are brings up a huge conceptual problem for me.
What's that?
Well, if this river is naturally a meandering system, meaning it constantly wants to carve curves, move sideways, and change its path over the centuries, aren't we basically building our massive cities like St. Louis and New Orleans on a moving treadmill?
Well, what's fascinating here is that you've just articulated the fundamental tension of the entire Mississippi basin.
Yes.
You are building on a treadmill.
That sounds like a terrible real estate investment.
It really is, hydrologically speaking. And to understand why, we need to look at the actual physics of the meandering river.
Please do, because I think a lot of you listening just picture water lazily curving through a green field. But there's actually a violent engine driving that movement, right?
Absolutely. Think about water moving through a curve. The water on the outside of the curve has to travel faster to keep up. Just like, well,
like a runner in the outer lane of a track.
exactly like that. Because it's moving faster, it has more energy, so it actively eats away at the dirt on the outer riverbank. It erodes it.
Oh, I see.
Meanwhile, the water on the inside of the curve is moving slower. It loses energy, so it drops the sediment it was carrying, building up a sandbar.
So it's constantly biting off chunks of land on one side and spitting out new land on the other. It is physically migrating across the landscape.
Yes, it snakes back and forth.
All right.
Over centuries, a single bend might migrate miles across the floodplain. And in nature, this constant movement, along with the seasonal flooding, are features, not bugs.
It's how the system survives.
Exactly. That movement is how the river stays healthy. When the river overtops its banks during a spring flood, it carries sediment from as far away as the Rockies and spreads it all across the surrounding land.
Free fertilizer.
Basically, yes. That seasonal deposit of mud is what replenishes the soil nutrients. It is the sole reason the Mississippi Basin is one of the most incredibly fertile agricultural regions on the planet.
And down at the mouth of the river, that same process of spreading sediment is exactly what builds the delta. The land literally rises from the mud.
It does.
So the river naturally wants to sway back and forth like a garden hose left running on the grass. But the problem is we built billion-dollar economies, thousands of farms, and massive urban centers right on the edge of that hose.
We really did.
We looked at the treadmill and basically decided we couldn't allow it to move anymore.
We demanded permanence from a system defined by flux. The moment human civilization decided that a specific bend in the river had to stay exactly where it was so a city wouldn't wash away, we had to invent ways to lock that treadmill in place.
And that is where the illusion of control begins, right?
Exactly. Because by trying to stop this natural movement, we didn't eliminate the river's energy. We just forced that energy to manifest in much more dangerous ways.
Which brings us perfectly into the heavy engineering phase of this deep dive. Because once humanity decides to fight the physics of water, we don't mess around.
Not at all.
The United States Army Corps of Engineers stepped in with an absolute arsenal of infrastructure. We waged war on the river. Let's walk through the weapons we use, starting with the most famous one, levees.
Levees are the first line of defense. They're essentially massive, artificial earthen walls or embankments built right along the edges of the riverbanks.
Just to hold it back.
Yeah, the goal is a simple containment. You build a wall so the water stays inside the channel and doesn't spill over into the cities and farmland during the spring melt. Today, there are thousands of miles of levees lining the Mississippi.
But putting water in a tight hallway has to change how it behaves, right? I mean, if you put your thumb over the end of a running hose, the water doesn't stop. It shoots out faster.
That is a perfect analogy. And that is the central, terrifying trade-off of levees. When you constrain the river, you prevent the natural flooding.
Right. Which sounds good for the people living there.
It does, but that means you stop the natural soil renewal we just talked about?
Yeah.
But from a purely hydraulic standpoint, because the water is squeezed into a tight, narrow channel, instead of being allowed to spread out safely over a 50-mile wide floodplain, it stacks up.
It gets taller.
It gets much deeper and it moves much, much faster. So you correct the erosion on the riverbed, and when floods do happen downstream, they strike with dramatically more speed and ferocity.
Okay, so levees squeeze the water to keep it in place. But up in the upper Mississippi, we use a completely different tool locks and dams.
We do.
I admit, I've seen these things, but the mechanics of them still feel like magic to me. They act like giant water elevators for cargo ships. How do they actually work?
It's a brilliant piece of engineering, honestly. The upper Mississippi naturally gets very shallow in the late summer, which is terrible for massive cargo barges.
They just run aground.
Exactly. So we built a staircase of dams across the river to hold the water back and create a series of deep artificial pools. But a barge can't just sail over a dam.
Right, it would just crash straight into a massive concrete wall.
So built into the side of the dam is a lock. The lock is basically a massive concrete bathtub with watertight steel gates on both ends.
Okay, I'm picturing a bathtub.
Let's say a barge wants to go downstream. It pulls into the lock and the gates close behind it. At this point, the water inside the lock is at the same high level as the river upstream.
Makes sense.
Then valves are opened at the bottom of the lock and gravity slowly drains the water out into the lower part of the river.
Wait, so no pumps are used? It's just gravity doing all the heavy lifting?
Just gravity. The water level in the lock drops, lowering the massive 1,000-ton barge gently down. Once the water level inside matches the lower river level, the front gates swing open and the barge sails out.
That is incredible.
We basically turned a shallow, unpredictable river into a highly regulated, stepped canal to guarantee a 9-foot shipping channel year-round.
That is so clever. But the most aggressive engineering tactic has to be channelization. The Army Corps actually went in and cut off the natural curves of the river.
Yes, they did.
They took those sweeping meanders and just dynamited a straight trench across the neck of the curve.
In the 1930s, the Army Corps instituted a massive cutoff program. They artificially straightened the river. By bypassing the curves, they actually shortened the Mississippi River by over 150 miles.
Wait, why on earth would you intentionally shorten a massive river? What's the benefit?
To speed up the water. The thought process at the time was, if we make the river straight, floodwaters will flush out to the Gulf of Mexico faster, reducing the risk of floods in the middle sections of the river.
Okay, get the water out of the house as fast as possible.
Exactly. And it did speed up the water.
Wow.
But as we discussed with the levees, Faster water has more kinetic energy. It became far more erosive and far more dangerous to the infrastructure downstream.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because all of this aggressive engineering, the levees squeezing the water, the channelization speeding it up, it all culminates in the ultimate symbol of our fragile control.
The old river control structure.
Yes. I brought this up at the very beginning of the deep dive. The idea of a concrete wall preventing a geographic apocalypse. Let's dive into the Atchafalaya threat. What exactly is happening here?
To understand the Atchafalaya threat, you have to remember that a river always wants to take the path of least resistance to the ocean. It wants the steepest, shortest route.
Gravity always wins.
Always. Over thousands of years, as the Mississippi meandered and dumped sediment into the Gulf, it literally built the toe of Louisiana further and further out into the ocean.
So the path to the ocean kept getting longer and flatter.
Exactly. The current route past Baton Rouge and New Orleans is incredibly long, flat, and totally choked with sediment. So physics is pulling at the water.
Looking for a shortcut.
Right. About 150 miles upstream of New Orleans, there is another smaller river that breaks off the Mississippi and runs south, called the Atchafalaya River. The route down the Atchafalaya to the Gulf is less than half the distance of the current Mississippi route.
Wow, half the distance.
And it is much steeper and much faster.
So the water essentially wants to turn right and take the shortcut.
Yes. If left to its own devices, the Mississippi would have jumped its banks, abandoned New Orleans entirely, and permanently shifted its main flow down the Atchafalaya River back in the 1970s.
But if it did that, the consequences would be apocalyptic. I mean, if the main flow of the Mississippi abandons its current channel, the stretch of river that goes past Baton Rouge and New Orleans would basically turn into a salty, stagnant creek.
It would be an unmitigated disaster for the United States economy. That stretch of the river is home to some of the most critical petrochemical complexes, grain export terminals, and port facilities in the world.
And they all rely on that water.
They rely on the deep, powerful flow of fresh water. If the river shifts, they lose their fresh water supply. Salt water from the Gulf would intrude into the drinking water systems of millions of people, and massive cargo ships would physically not be able to reach the ports.
It would completely upend American global trade overnight.
It would.
So obviously we couldn't let it happen. We couldn't let geography take its course. How did we stop it?
We built the old river control structure. Completed in 1963, it is a massive fortified complex of concrete piers, steel gates, and hydroelectric turbines sitting right at the junction where the river desperately wants to turn.
Like a giant dam.
It acts more like a giant faucet. It physically holds the main force of the Mississippi hostage, forcing it to stay in its current channel and only allowing precisely 30% of the water to flow down into the Atchafalaya.
I am just picturing this colossal wall taking the brunt of 40% of the country's drainage. That structural stress must be unimaginable.
Oh, it is terrifying. During a massive flood in 1973, the sheer force of the water almost destroyed the structure.
Really?
Yes. The water scoured a hole under the foundation so deep it nearly collapsed the entire concrete complex. The Army Corps had to engage in emergency engineering just to keep it standing, and they've been reinforcing it constantly ever since. It's the ultimate bottleneck.
But wait, this brings up another massive consequence. If the river's natural cycle is to flood and deposit sediment to build land, and we have walled off the river with levees, and we are holding back the flow at the old river control structure, aren't we basically starving the Louisiana coast to death?
You've hit on the tragic irony of the entire system.
Yes.
That is the exact, literal cost of holding the line.
We're killing the coast to save the shipping lanes.
By locking the river in a straitjacket, the sediment that used to fan out over thousands of square miles and build up the coastal wetlands is now trapped in the channel. It is shot out of the mouth of the river down below New Orleans like a fire hose, straight over the continental shelf and into the deep, dark waters of the Gulf of Mexico, where it does absolutely no good.
So the mud isn't replacing the land that naturally sinks over time.
Exactly. The Louisiana Delta is made of soft mud. It naturally sinks and compresses over time. Without the annual floods delivering a new layer of mud to build it back up, the land is just dissolving into the ocean.
That is heartbreaking.
The fragile, sinking delta is collapsing because it is no longer being fed. We are losing a football field of land every 100 minutes. We have made a conscious, systemic trade. We are trading the survival of the coastal wetlands for the preservation of deep shipping lanes and urban permanence.
It's like we've optimized the system to the point where it has lost all its natural resilience.
That's a really profound way to frame it. The system stores its wildness for later.
Stores it for later.
Yeah. When you over-constrain a natural ecosystem, you strip away its ability to adapt gradually. In nature, small seasonal floods act as release valves. They diffuse energy. But we eliminated those small release valves.
So the pressure just builds and builds.
Exactly. When a failure inevitably happens now, when a levee breaks or a control structure gives way, it is no longer a gradual natural adaptation. It is a catastrophic, explosive risk. A controlled river doesn't stop being wild, it just waits.
So what does this all mean on a macro level? Why are we doing this? Why do we spend billions of dollars, risk catastrophic failure, and sacrifice our coastlines to fight the basic physics of water?
Well, the answer unequivocally is money.
Right. It always is. The Mississippi is the economic backbone of the United States. And that brings us to how this river acts as an engine for the distribution of power and wealth.
You really cannot separate the hydrology of the river from the economics of the river basin. The Mississippi River transforms the physical movement of water into food production, industrial transport, energy, and immense wealth.
It's a massive conveyor belt.
It is. The basin drains the American Midwest, which produces a staggering share of global agricultural exports. We're talking about hundreds of millions of tons of corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton. The incredibly flat, rich floodplains, the ones created by the very meandering we stopped, by the way, are ideal for large-scale, highly mechanized agribusiness.
And once you harvest millions of tons of grain, you have to move it to the global market. You can't just put that all on airplanes. This is where the river really shines. It acts as this massive, vibrating liquid highway.
The efficiency of river transport is hard to overstate. A single standard river barge can hold the same amount of dry cargo as about 15 large rail cars, or nearly 70 semi-trucks.
Wow, 70 semi-trucks in one barge.
And these barges are lashed together into massive tows, sometimes 40 barges tied together, pushed by a single towboat.
So one boat is pushing the equivalent of nearly 3,000 semi-trucks down the river. That is insane.
Precisely. The fuel efficiency is unmatched. Shipping by barge is incredibly cheap compared to overland transport. It is the invisible engine that keeps American agricultural and industrial products competitive on the global market. They move grain south, and they move oil, coal, and chemicals north and south.
But a system this massive, operating on this scale, inherently creates a massive footprint. We have these winners, the global agribusinesses, the shipping conglomerates, the consumers getting cheap food. But who absorbs the cost?
That is the big question.
Because the environmental trade-offs here are severe. Let's look at what happens in the Gulf of Mexico. I want to talk about the dead zone.
The dead zone is the direct result of how we farm the upper basin. Because we built levees and stopped the natural floods from replenishing the soil with river mud, modern farms rely heavily on massive applications of artificial fertilizers, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus.
And when it rains, that fertilizer doesn't just stay neatly in the dirt.
Right. The rain washes the excess fertilizer off the fields, into the local creeks, into the tributary rivers, and eventually it all funnels into the main stem of the Mississippi.
Like a giant drain.
The river acts as a continent-sized sewer pipe for agricultural runoff, carrying thousands of tons of nutrients south. When that nutrient-rich water hits the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it triggers a biological chain reaction.
Walk me through the actual biology of that, because nutrient-rich sounds like a good thing, but obviously it's not.
It's way too much of a good thing. The massive influx of nitrogen and phosphorus acts like superfood for phytoplankton microscopic algae. You get these colossal, explosive algae blooms that spread across thousands of square miles of the ocean surface.
Okay, so a massive algae bloom.
But algae have a short lifespan. When this massive volume of algae dies, it sinks to the bottom of the Gulf.
And then what? Does it just sit there on the bottom?
No, the decomposition process begins. Trillions of bacteria begin to feast on the dead algae. And just like us, those bacteria need oxygen to breathe.
Uh-oh, I see where this is going.
Because there is such an overwhelming amount of dead algae to eat, the bacteria populations completely explode, and they literally vacuum all the dissolved oxygen out of the surrounding water. This creates a state of hypoxia water with little to no oxygen.
Which means any marine life that cannot swim away fast enough
Suffocates. The crabs, the shrimp, the bottom-dwelling fish, they just die. It creates a massive oxygen-depleted area called the dead zone, which can grow to be the size of New Jersey.
That is devastating.
It severely impacts the commercial fisheries in the Gulf. We are essentially trading high corn yields in Iowa for collapsed shrimp harvests in Louisiana.
And the economic footprint extends to industrial consequences as well, right? In the lower Mississippi, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, there is a heavily concentrated petrochemical corridor.
Sometimes referred to in sociological studies as Cancer Alley.
Right. The river provides the deep draft for ocean-going oil tankers and the immense volume of water needed for chemical cooling processes. Now, the industrial development brings massive tax revenue, jobs, and global energy dominance to the region, but the trade-off is significant localized pollution.
Very significant.
The air and water quality impacts on the communities living directly adjacent to these massive manufacturing hubs are severe. In sociological studies and public health research, this specific stretch of the river is frequently analyzed due to elevated health risks and environmental degradation. Both sides of the issue are heavily debated, but the reality of the pollution is undeniably a major factor for those residents.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we're really analyzing is a deep imbalance in spatial power dynamics. The Mississippi River is a masterclass in the classic upstream versus downstream conflict.
Explain how that dynamic works in practice for us.
When a decision is made upstream, say, a decision to tile a farm field so it drains water faster, or a decision to build a higher levee to protect a Midwestern city, that decision is designed to maximize economic output or safety for that specific upstream location.
Makes sense. People want to protect their own homes.
But water doesn't disappear. If you push water off your land faster, it just rushes downstream to your neighbor. The physical costs of those upstream decisions, the excess fertilizer, the amplified flood crests, the chemical runoff, are pushed south, they accumulate, and they are heavily concentrated downstream.
It makes the river sound less like a shared natural resource and more like an invisible political boundary. It's an engine that redistributes wealth and safety to certain regions while actively redistributing danger and pollution to others.
Water systems inherently create domestic geopolitical tension. We like to think of a river as a politically neutral feature of the landscape, but the management of it is intensely political.
It's all choices.
Exactly. The decisions about where to build levees, where to dynamite a spillway, what industries to permit on the banks, and whose farmland gets sacrificed to save a city, those are essentially calculations about who is deemed worth protecting and who's expected to carry the cost. Control of the river is a physical map of power.
That is a really heavy thought to carry, but I think it's crucial that we don't just view the river purely as a hydraulic machine or a political battleground. Because despite all the heavy industry, the concrete walls, and the power dynamics, for the millions of people who actually live along its banks, the river remains a deeply sensory, cultural, and sometimes terrifying presence. It is a threshold.
Oh, the cultural and mythological weight of the Mississippi cannot be overstated. Even though it's heavily engineered, it is still a profound storyteller in the American consciousness.
Like with music.
Think about its role in music. Absolutely. The river is the literal birthplace of the blues. The pain, the labor, and the rhythm of life on the levees and the Delta cotton fields gave birth to a musical tradition that traveled up the river to Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago.
Yeah.
It became the foundation for jazz, rock and roll, and hip-hop.
The river carried the culture.
Cities like New Orleans don't just sit next to the river, you know. Their entire cultural identity, their architecture, their cuisine was forged by the river's movement and its history.
And that history carries such intense duality. During the era of slavery, the river was the primary economic tool for the plantation system. It was a mechanism of deep oppression.
It was a brutal reality.
Enslaved people were transported down the river, sold at riverfront markets, and forced to labor on the cotton and sugar plantations that lined the banks. The river was the chain that held the economy of slavery together. But at the exact same time, in the cultural imagination, it served as a symbolic boundary and a pathway to freedom.
You see this cemented in American literature, most famously in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Right, the raft on the river.
Exactly. The river in that novel represents an escape from the rigid, civilized society on the banks. When Huck and Jim are out on the raft on the water, the river is a liminal space. It's a space in between worlds where societal rules are suspended and identity can be reshaped.
That duality extends to spiritual beliefs as well, doesn't it? For many indigenous nations, the Mississippi, the father of waters, has always been viewed as a living spirit.
Yes, very much so.
It is a life force where humans are considered part of the broader ecological system, not masters meant to control it. And in Christian traditions, particularly in the Deep South, the river is intensely symbolic. It's the site of baptism and cleansing. Immersing oneself in the raw water represents a spiritual rebirth, washing away the past.
But the terrifying duality of the river is that the very force that gives life, fertility, and spiritual cleansing can also violently take it away. So we have to ask what happens when that deep cultural reverence collides with an engineering failure. Because when a river this size breaks its constraints, it doesn't just flood a basement, it reshapes reality.
So, what does this all mean? When the machine breaks, let's look at the defining disaster, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a profound failure of the levee system.
The 1927 flood is one of the most destructive and transformative events in U.S. history. After months of unprecedented heavy rain across the entire basin, the river swelled to unimaginable proportions.
And the levees couldn't handle it.
And this is where the physics of levees came back to haunt us. Because the water was confined between massive earthen walls, it couldn't spread out laterally, so it rose vertically. It rose higher, faster, and with more kinetic energy than ever before.
The accounts of this are horrifying. When a levee is under that much pressure, it doesn't just gently spill over, right?
No, not at all. When the water finally overtopped and breached the levees, creating what are called crevasses, the sheer weight and roar of the water was like an explosion.
An explosion of water.
It scoured trenches into the earth 80 feet deep. The floodwater inundated 27,000 square miles across 7 states. It displaced nearly 700,000 people, destroying thousands of homes and farms.
And the political decisions made during that disaster were brutal. To save the wealthy, economically vital city of New Orleans from flooding, the authorities literally used dynamite to blow up the levee south of the city at Poydras.
It was a drastic choice.
They intentionally flooded the poorer rural parishes of St. Bernard and Plaquemines to relieve the pressure on the city. It proved undeniably that floods aren't just natural acts of God anymore. They are explicitly shaped by human infrastructure and human decisions.
And that event birthed the modern era of federal control. The Army Corps took total jurisdiction over the river after 1927, leading to the massive system of levees and the old river control structure we have today. But the terrifying reality is that our modern infrastructure hasn't eliminated the risk. It has transformed it into what hydrologists call compound risk.
Wait, I need you to explain this, because the way disasters happen today on a heavily managed river isn't just about getting wet. The mechanisms of failure are completely different now.
A compound risk means a disaster cascades across multiple human systems. Imagine a modern scenario. Climate volatility drives a localized, extreme, sustained rainfall event. The river swells rapidly. That puts immense physical pressure on the aging levee infrastructure.
Okay, setting the stage.
Now, if a levee fails today, it doesn't just release muddy water into a cotton field. It releases the modern industrial reality of the river.
Right, it hits the infrastructure we built behind the walls.
The floodwaters inundate sprawling chemical plants, knocking out their backup generators and causing toxic chemical releases. The water overwhelms urban wastewater treatment plants, mixing raw sewage into the floodwaters.
That is a toxic nightmare.
It washes thousands of tons of concentrated agricultural pesticides from storage facilities directly into residential neighborhoods. The floodwater itself becomes a highly contaminated toxic hazard.
So an extreme weather event causes an infrastructure failure, which triggers a massive chemical pollution release, which destroys the local economy and creates a long-term public health crisis. The disaster basically multiplies itself.
Precisely. Disasters today are rarely isolated physical events. They are the result of a highly complex human system catastrophically failing to absorb the stress it has created for itself.
To bring this scale down to earth, I want to zoom in on the human element for a second. We've talked about billions of dollars and millions of gallons of water, but let's look at the daily sensory lives of the people who actually operate inside this massive machine.
It's completely different for everyone.
It is, because their experiences of the exact same body of water are entirely contradictory. For you listening, imagine you are a commercial fisherman on the lower Mississippi or the Delta. Your entire rhythm of life revolves around reading the water.
You're out there every day.
You're out there on a small boat before sunrise. Your sensory world is intensely localized. You are listening to the sound of the water lapping against the hull, smelling the distinct metallic scent of the mud, feeling the heavy humidity, and watching the subtle ripples that tell you how the current is shifting underneath.
You rely on the ecosystem.
Your livelihood depends entirely on a healthy, functioning ecosystem. which means you live at the absolute mercy of upstream pollution, or the Army Corps opening a spillway and changing the salinity of your fishing grounds. You don't try to control the river. Your survival requires deep intuition and adapting to its moods.
Now contrast that intimate sensory relationship with a commercial farmer living 50 miles upriver, right behind a massive levee on the floodplain.
A totally different world.
The farmer's relationship with the river is a constant, highly stressful negotiation. On one hand, you view the river as a resource. You desperately need the river's water, or at least the groundwater it feeds, for irrigation. You rely on the fertile soil it left behind centuries ago.
But on the
other hand, every single spring melt brings a profound existential anxiety. You stand on the levee looking at a wall of water that is physically higher than the roof of your house. You live in a permanent state of trusting the river's historical fertility, while actively fearing its immediate physical power to erase everything you own.
And then zoom out to the river itself and imagine a worker on one of those massive barge tows pushing grain to New Orleans. For the barge worker, the river isn't a delicate ecosystem, and it isn't an existential threat to a farm. It is a vibrating, isolating highway.
It's purely industrial for them.
Their sensory experience is the constant deep thrum of massive 1,000-horsepower diesel engines. It's the smell of exhaust and steel. Their interaction with the water is entirely functional, calculating flow rates, communicating with lockmasters via radio, and navigating an endless sequence of concrete walls and navigation buoys. They experience the river purely as infrastructure in motion.
3 entirely different human experiences: intuition, anxiety, and utility, all defined by the exact same current of water. And what's fascinating here is that to truly understand what makes the Mississippi's identity so entirely unique on a global scale, we have to look outward.
We have to compare it.
We have to see what it's not. If we place the Mississippi into a global context alongside the rest of the world's great rivers, its true character suddenly clicks into focus.
Let's do that, because mapping it against other rivers really helped me understand the specific brand of madness we've applied to the Mississippi. Let's start with the Nile River in Egypt.
The Nile is historically defined by deep predictability. For millennia, its annual floods were so reliable, arriving at roughly the same time and with roughly the same volume, that they essentially built and sustained ancient Egyptian civilization.
You could set your calendar to it.
The flooding wasn't a threat. It was a stable, life-giving routine. The Mississippi, however, is highly variable. It swings wildly between extreme droughts that ground barge traffic and massive floods that threaten cities. It required aggressive human control precisely because it lacked that natural predictability.
And what about the Amazon River in South America? The sheer scale of it is hard to fathom.
The Amazon is defined by overwhelming dominant scale. It is so vast, so incredibly biodiverse, and carries so much water, more than the next 7 largest rivers combined, that it largely defies human control.
It's just too big to tame.
Its massive floodplains still function naturally. The water spreads out for miles into the jungle during the rainy season. The Mississippi is much smaller in discharge, but it represents humanity's absolute determination to impose rigid, artificial structure on nature. We let the Amazon be wild. We put the Mississippi in a box.
Then you look at the Colorado River out west. We hear about the Colorado constantly in the context of water wars.
Because the Colorado is defined by fundamental scarcity. The entire system is overallocated. Every single drop is legally accounted for before it even falls as snow.
There just isn't enough water to go around.
The core conflict in the West is about managing a chronic, terrifying lack of water. The Mississippi, generally speaking, is defined by abundance. Our core conflict isn't about running out of water. It is almost entirely about having far too much water and fighting over where to put it.
And culturally, if we look at the Ganges River in India,
the Ganges is explicitly and formally sacred. It is deified as a goddess in Hinduism, central to deep religious rituals, pilgrimage, and direct worship. Millions bathe in it for purification.
A literal living deity to them.
The Mississippi, as we discussed, holds immense cultural, musical, and symbolic meaning. It is the river of stories, but it is not worshipped as a literal deity. It is interpreted and utilized rather than venerated.
And finally, the Yangtze River in China. This one feels like the closest parallel to the engineering of the Mississippi, but the approach is totally different.
The Yangtze is a story of massive, centralized control. It is managed through nationally directed, top-down infrastructure projects, most notably the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest power station in the world.
The government just decides and builds it.
When the state wants to act, It acts with singular authority. The Mississippi, by contrast, is a patchwork of intensely fragmented control. Yes, the Federal Army Corps is the primary muscle, but the river is also managed by dozens of state governments, hundreds of local levee boards, private shipping industries, and agricultural lobbies, all pulling in completely different directions.
So if we synthesize all of that, the Mississippi isn't the biggest river, it isn't the wildest, it isn't the most predictable, and it isn't the most sacred. It is moderate in flow compared to the Amazon, and abundant compared to the Colorado.
But it's true. Unique identity lies in its astonishing complexity.
Complexity, yeah.
Yeah, because it isn't managed by one single supreme authority. It is intensely managed across multiple jurisdictions with deeply competing interests. The farmer wants the water low, the barge captain wants the water high, the coastal resident wants the sediment, and the city wants the walls reinforced. It might actually be the most negotiated river in the entire world. This raises an important question, though. When you have a system that is this rigidly engineered, this heavily burdened, and this fragmented in its political management, can it survive the future?
Because the rules of the game are changing.
Because the Mississippi is facing compounding, unprecedented stresses. We are looking at increased climate volatility, which means heavier, more concentrated rainfall events hitting the upper basin. We're looking at rising sea levels in the Gulf, pushing saltwater further up the collapsing delta.
And the infrastructure is getting old.
Very old. We're looking at an incredibly massive aging infrastructure of earthen levees, concrete locks, and the old river control structure, much of which was designed and built well over half a century ago.
The billion-dollar question is, can a system built on fragmented negotiation and rigid concrete control adapt to a future that demands extreme flexibility?
And that is the tension we live with every single day the water flows south.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's just take a breath and recap the sheer monumental distance we've covered on this deep dive.
It's a lot to process.
We started 10,000 years ago with a wild, braided, post-glacial force of nature that was busy carving out the center of the North American continent. We saw how its natural meandering and flooding gathered early civilization into a massive, thriving metropolis at Cahokia.
A completely different world back then.
We watched the modern era transform that natural force into a heavily engineered machine, a circulatory system forced into a straitjacket of levees, locks, and concrete control structures. We examined the brutal economic trade-offs, where we actively sacrifice the survival of our coastal wetlands and marine ecosystems just to guarantee the efficiency of global shipping lanes and agricultural output.
The invisible costs of our economy.
And we explored how, despite all the concrete, the river acts as a cultural mirror, reflecting both the darkest periods of human oppression and our deepest, most profound desires for freedom.
If we step back from the hydrology and the engineering, the Mississippi River is ultimately a profound metaphor for the human experience itself. Just look at the parallels.
I love this, yes.
We spend our entire lives trying to structure and control our environments. We build our own internal levees to manage risk, to keep out the chaos of the world, and to optimize our daily productivity. We all want a straight, predictable channel.
We really do. We crave that stability.
But the physics of the river teach us that chaos, shifting currents, and uncertainty are not bugs in the system. They are the fundamental features of reality. Rigid control might create the illusion of short-term stability, but it is surrender, flexibility, and adaptation that actually create long-term resilience.
That is so true.
You can build a massive concrete structure, but if it cannot bend, if it cannot absorb the unexpected surge, the pressure will eventually break it.
Wow. That is exactly the lesson we refuse to learn, isn't it? You know, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as we close out today. Something to think about that builds on everything we've uncovered.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a team of archaeologists, 10,000 years in the future, digging up the buried ruins of the lower Mississippi Valley. They will eventually uncover the massive, continuous concrete walls of our levees. They will unearth the rusted steel miter gates of the locks.
They'll find a lot of concrete.
And deep in the mud of Louisiana, they will find the colossal ruined fortress of the old river control structure that we built to hold back the Atchafalaya. When they look at the sheer scale of all that infrastructure, will they conclude that we were an incredibly advanced, masterful civilization that brilliantly commanded the elemental forces of nature?
That's a good question.
Or will they map out the sunken, vanished delta, analyze the poisoned soil of the dead zones, track the artificially diverted flows, and realize the quiet truth that we were a society deeply, permanently held hostage by the very river we proudly claim to control.
That is quite the image to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As you go about your day, take a look around and see if you can spot the engineered rivers in your own life, the wild, unpredictable things you've tried to force into a straitjacket, and ask yourself, is it time to let the water move?